Madeline's eyes fluttered open, the lingering weight of sleep clinging to her like a fog. The dream was still there, imprinted in her mind with crystal clarity, the sound of his voice, the way he tilted his head when he listened, the warmth in his eyes as he reached for her hand. Wesley. It was always Wesley. She rolled onto her side and stared at the ceiling, willing herself to let it go. It was absurd. This man wasn't real. He couldn't be. And yet, night after night, he returned. Their conversations felt effortless, as though they had known each other forever. He was charming, perceptive, and so disarmingly familiar that waking up without him felt like stepping into the wrong life. She rubbed her temples and forced herself upright. The world outside her window was still waking up, the hazy morning light stretching over the rooftops of her quiet neighborhood. A distant car honked, a dog barked, and somewhere, a child laughed. The real world. The one that mattered. Dragging herself out of bed, she padded into the kitchen, her sock-clad feet whispering against the linoleum. The tiny apartment was a mess of half-finished sketches, scattered pencils, and a few coffee cups she had forgotten to rinse out. It smelled of paint and a hint of lavender from the candle she kept burning near her desk. She filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and ran a hand through her tangled hair. Her son, Theo, was still asleep in the next room. She glanced at the clock. He had another 20 minutes before she needed to wake him. Enough time for tea, maybe a moment of stillness. But even as she reached for her favorite mug, a weight pressed against her chest. Wesley's voice still echoed in her ears, warm and steady. "You're not alone, you know." She exhaled sharply and shook her head. It wasn't real. It was just a dream. The knock at the door startled her. Her heart kicked up, and for a brief, irrational moment, she thought it was him. Which was insane. She wasn't still dreaming. She wiped her hands on her pajama pants and hesitated before unlocking the door. Standing in the hallway, looking equally as stunned as she felt, was Wesley. For a moment, neither of them moved. His crisp navy jacket was slightly askew, as if he had thrown it on in a hurry. His dark hair was tousled, and his sharp green eyes, those same eyes she had memorized in countless dreams, locked onto hers with a mixture of disbelief and something close to relief. "You're real," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "And, you remember too, don't you?" Madeline opened her mouth, then closed it. Her mind was racing, flipping through every possible logical explanation. Maybe she was still asleep. Maybe she was losing her mind. Maybe. She gripped the edge of the doorframe to steady herself. "Who are you?" Wesley let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "I was about to ask you the same thing." The kettle shrieked behind her, the sound slicing through the thick silence. She jumped, turning instinctively toward the kitchen, then back at him. He was still standing there, as solid as the floor beneath her feet, not vanishing like a dream should. She shook her head. "I don't understand what's happening." Wesley took a hesitant step forward, searching her face as if the answer might be written there. "Neither do I." Her pulse was hammering. This was impossible. She knew every feature of his face, every inflection of his voice, and yet she had never met him before. Had she? She glanced over her shoulder toward Theo's room. He was still asleep, unaware that his mother was currently questioning the laws of reality in their doorway. She turned back to Wesley, her grip on the doorframe tightening. "Come inside." The words left her mouth before she could fully think them through. Wesley hesitated only a moment before stepping over the threshold. He smelled like something expensive and clean, like cedarwood and the crispness of early autumn. He stood in the middle of her small apartment, looking wildly out of place among the paint-splattered drop cloths and the stack of overdue bills on the counter. She shut the door and faced him, crossing her arms. "I need you to tell me what's going on." His gaze drifted over the sketches pinned to the wall before returning to her. I was hoping you could tell me. Her head shook automatically. I don't know you. His lips pressed together. That's not true. Madeline exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers to her temple. Okay. Fine. I don't know you in real life. Something flickered across his face, some deep internal battle she couldn't quite decipher. You dream about me. It wasn't a question. Her throat went dry. And you dream about me. Yes. The air between them felt charged, thick with unspoken words. Madeline had never believed in fate, in cosmic forces aligning to bring two people together. She believed in deadlines, in unpaid bills, in the struggle of keeping her head above water. This didn't belong in her world. Wesley ran a hand down his face, exhaling slowly. I thought I was losing my mind. But I had to see if you were real. I had to know. Madeline swallowed. How did you find me? His gaze flickered downward, as if he wasn't sure he wanted to say. I started looking for places from my dreams. Landmarks, street names, anything that felt familiar. And then I saw you. Her stomach tightened. You just saw me? Wesley let out a breathy laugh. I walked past a gallery 2 blocks from here. There was a painting in the window. A woman standing on a bridge. It was yours. Madeline's heart pounded. She knew exactly which painting he meant. You painted me, he said quietly. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. This was too much. Too big. She needed time to process, to breathe. But Wesley was standing here, real and impossible, looking at her like she was the missing piece of a puzzle he had spent years trying to solve. A door creaked down the hall. Theo's sleepy voice called from his bedroom, Mom? Madeline jolted, reality snapping back into place. I need to get my son ready for school, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. You should go. Wesley hesitated, his expression unreadable. But he nodded. I'll be back, he said, a promise rather than a threat. Madeline wasn't sure if that terrified her or if some small, reckless part of her was already hoping he would. Wesley sat across from Madeline at her kitchen table, his hands resting on his knees as if he were physically holding himself back from reaching across the small space between them. The tension in the air was thick, coiling tighter with every second of silence. Neither of them had touched their tea. The steam curled lazily toward the ceiling, ignored. So, Madeline finally said, her voice deliberately even, you're telling me you've been dreaming about me. Wesley inhaled slowly, nodding once. Yes. For how long? His gaze flickered to the window, like he was checking to see if the world outside was still functioning the way it was supposed to. A little over a year. Madeline's stomach flipped violently, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. That couldn't be right. That's not possible. His brows lifted slightly. Why not? Because I've only been dreaming about you for 6 months. The words hung between them, heavy and disorienting. Wesley sat back slightly, eyes scanning her face as if he could read the answer in her expression. Madeline's fingers curled around the handle of her mug, but she didn't lift it. She wasn't sure her hands were steady enough for that. Describe your dreams, Wesley said after a moment, his voice quieter now. She blinked at him. What? If we're really sharing the same dreams, we should be able to compare them. The logical part of her agreed. If they were going to make sense of this, they needed information. The rest of her, though, recoiled at the idea of speaking them out loud. They weren't just dreams. They were something deeper, more personal, more intimate. The conversations they had, the way he looked at her in those moments, the feeling that she had always known him, even when she was certain she had never seen him before in her life. Still, she took a breath and forced herself to speak. We're always talking, she said. Not about anything in particular, but it always feels important. Wesley nodded slowly, watching her carefully. Go on. Madeline dropped her gaze to the table, tracing the faint scratches in the wood with her nail. Sometimes we're in a park. There's a little pond with ducks. Other times, we're sitting in a dimly lit restaurant, but I never see food. Just candles and, she hesitated, feeling self-conscious. His lips parted slightly. And what? She exhaled. You looking at me like you're trying to figure something out. The sharp inhale of breath from Wesley sent a shiver up her spine. That happens in your dreams too, she murmured. His voice was quiet. Yes. Her throat tightened. They went back and forth, recalling small details, testing each other's memories. She brought up the dream where they sat on a rooftop, watching the city lights. He filled in the detail about the radio playing from a nearby window. He mentioned the time they had walked through a farmer's market, and she completed the image with the sound of a woman laughing behind them. With each correct answer, Madeline's pulse climbed higher. Wesley leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. What do you remember about last night? Her hands clenched. We were in a library. His green eyes locked onto hers. And? She swallowed. You pulled a book off the shelf and handed it to me. You told me I'd like it. His gaze didn't waver. What book? Madeline felt her chest tighten. Persuasion. Wesley exhaled sharply, the sound barely more than a breath. He stared at her like she had just cracked open a door neither of them had known was locked. The air seemed to shift. A slow, creeping realization settled over them, sinking into their bones. This wasn't some strange coincidence. It wasn't a trick of the mind or a symptom of exhaustion or stress. Madeline pushed her chair back and stood up abruptly, pacing to the other side of the kitchen. Okay. Let's say this is actually happening. It is happening. She shot him a look. Let's say we agree on that. What do we do now? Wesley rubbed his hands over his face, exhaling slowly. I have no idea. The words shouldn't have made her stomach drop, but they did. She was good at solving problems. She had spent her whole life figuring things out, making the best of bad situations, finding a way forward. But this? There was no blueprint for this. She leaned against the counter, gripping the edge tightly. Maybe we're just going crazy, she said, only half joking. Wesley let out a hollow laugh. If we are, at least we're going crazy together. She closed her eyes, trying to think. We need a way to prove this isn't some kind of subconscious trick. Something external. Something solid. Wesley sat up straighter. A test. Madeline opened her mouth to respond, then hesitated. Fine, she said slowly. Let's each write down what we dreamed tonight. No talking about it first. Tomorrow, we compare. He nodded. Agreed. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of everything settling in. Madeline sighed, running a hand through her hair. This is the weirdest thing that has ever happened to me. Wesley let out a breathy laugh. Same. The kettle on the stove had long since gone cold. Neither of them noticed. Madeline stood by the window, arms crossed, watching Wesley pace outside her apartment. He had been standing by his car for at least 5 minutes, staring at his phone like it held the meaning of life. Or maybe just an escape route. She understood the hesitation. This was ridiculous. Two strangers, bound together by dreams they couldn't explain, deciding to spend an entire day together just to see if, what? A lightning bolt of truth would strike them? A hidden door to some forgotten memory would appear? She sighed, grabbed her keys, and stepped outside. You're overthinking. Wesley turned at the sound of her voice, blinking like she had startled him. I'm not overthinking. You are. She pointed at his phone. You were about to pretend you had an emergency meeting, weren't you? He slid his phone into his pocket, looking slightly guilty. Not an emergency meeting. Just a very well-timed, completely fabricated prior commitment. Madeline smirked. Too late. You're stuck with me now. He exhaled dramatically, then gestured toward the car. Fine. Where do we start? They drove in circles at first, listing the places that appeared in their dreams. The little park with the pond, the restaurant with candlelit tables, the library where he had handed her a copy of Persuasion. They figured they'd start with the park, mostly because it was nearby, and neither of them had any better ideas. It was quiet when they arrived, the morning air still cool, the trees rustling softly in the breeze. Ducks floated idly in the pond, completely unaware that two people were standing at the edge of the water, staring at them like they might hold the answers to the universe. Madeline exhaled. Okay. What now? Wesley shoved his hands into his pockets. I don't know. Do we? I don't know. Touch the water? Sit on a bench? Walk around and wait for something to feel familiar? She gave him a look. That's your plan? He lifted a shoulder. Do you have a better one? She didn't. They wandered the park, pausing at every vaguely familiar spot. They sat on a bench near a maple tree that looked suspiciously like the one from their dreams. They walked along the path where they had once spoken about nothing and everything. They leaned against the railing by the pond, waiting for some kind of spark, some moment of recognition that would explain how they both knew a life they had never lived. Nothing happened. No déjà vu. No flicker of recognition. No missing piece clicking into place. Wesley glanced at her. Anything? Madeline shook her head. You? He sighed. Nope. They left the park and moved on to the next location, a tiny, dimly lit restaurant on the corner of a street neither of them had ever been to before. But they knew it, both of them. In their dreams, they had sat by the window, lost in conversation, the warm glow of candlelight flickering against the glass. But when they stepped inside, reality felt different. The place looked right, smelled right, even had the same quiet hum of conversation, but something was missing. Madeline ran her fingers along the edge of the table. We've been here, she said softly. Wesley sat across from her, watching her carefully. Yeah. A waitress came by, cheerful and oblivious. What can I get you too? They exchanged glances. They hadn't actually planned to stay, but now that they were here, leaving felt like giving up too soon. Madeline glanced at the menu, even though she already knew. Do you have the lemon chicken? Wesley finished, eyes widening slightly. She stared at him. How did you know I was going to say that? His lips parted, but he didn't have an answer. The waitress smiled. Yeah, we have that. 2 orders. Neither of them looked away from each other. Madeline nodded slowly. Yeah. 2. They ate in silence at first, both lost in thought. Wesley leaned forward after a few minutes, voice quiet. I know we've sat here before. I know we've had this exact conversation before. Madeline nodded. But I don't remember how it ends. That was the problem. They had been here in their dreams, but the conversations were always more feeling than memory, always slipping away in the morning. No matter how many times they had spoken in their sleep, they couldn't quite hold on to the details. They stayed until their plates were empty, until they had retraced every step, until Wesley finally sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. This isn't working, he said. Madeline sat back, crossing her arms. So what now? We keep going? He hesitated. I don't know. She hated that answer. They left the restaurant and drove aimlessly for a while, heading toward the library. Maybe if they stood in the exact aisle, reached for the exact book, something would click into place. It didn't. They tried a coffee shop, a bookstore, even a street corner that Wesley swore had been in one of his dreams. But by the time the sky had started shifting into gold and orange, they both knew they weren't any closer to understanding. Wesley pulled the car up in front of Madeline's apartment, gripping the steering wheel. This was a terrible plan. Madeline let out a weak laugh. Yeah. But we had to try. He sighed, tapping his fingers against the wheel. Did you have a good time? She hesitated, then smiled slightly. Yeah. I did. He nodded, but the frustration was still there, pressing against the edges of his expression. We're back to square one. Madeline reached for the door handle. Well. See you in our dreams, I guess. Wesley let out a breathy chuckle. Yeah. See you there. She went inside, closing the door behind her, already knowing that no matter how much she willed it not to happen, she'd see him again that night. Madeline woke up before her alarm, her body restless, her mind heavy with the weight of yet another dream she didn't want to remember. The room was still dark, the edges of dawn just beginning to creep through the curtains. She lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the dream settle in the space between sleep and waking. Wesley had been there again. They had been sitting in a cafe, not the one where she worked, but a different one, smaller, quieter. There had been a storm outside, rain tapping against the window, the glow of streetlights reflecting off the pavement. He had been stirring sugar into his coffee, even though he had told her once that he didn't take sugar. She had called him out on it, and he had grinned, saying, "Maybe I've changed." It had felt so real. His voice, the warmth of the cafe, the way her chest had tightened when he looked at her like that, like she was the only thing in the world worth listening to. But it wasn't real. None of it was. She sighed, rubbing her hands over her face before sitting up. She needed to get moving. The day didn't care about the strange dreams that refused to leave her alone. There were real things to do, lunches to pack, backpacks to zip, bills to stress over. She climbed out of bed and padded into the kitchen, flipping on the light. The apartment was small, cluttered with unfinished paintings, stray brushes, and Theo's scattered toys. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the familiar hum of routine settling over her. A soft thump sounded from the hallway, followed by the shuffle of small feet. Mom? She turned to see Theo, still in his pajamas, his hair sticking up at odd angles. Hey, buddy, she said, reaching out to smooth his hair down. You're up early. He yawned and climbed onto one of the kitchen chairs, rubbing his eyes. Had a weird dream. Madeline's stomach tightened. Oh yeah? He nodded. There was a big fish in the bathtub. And it could talk. She let out a breath of laughter, relief flooding through her. A talking fish, huh? What did it say? Theo grinned sleepily. That I should eat more vegetables. Madeline chuckled and kissed the top of his head. Smart fish. They moved through their morning routine with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from years of doing everything alone. By the time they were out the door, Theo was fully awake, talking excitedly about a museum field trip his class was taking next week. At the school entrance, he hugged her quickly before running off to join his friends. Madeline lingered for a second, watching him go, then exhaled slowly. She had an hour before her shift at the cafe. Just enough time to check in at the art studio. The small rented space was quiet when she arrived, the familiar scent of paint and turpentine filling the air. She ran her fingers over a half-finished canvas, studying the brushstrokes, the way the colors blended together. It wasn't right. She had been stuck on this piece for weeks now, unable to finish it, unable to figure out what it was missing. She flipped open her sketchbook and froze. Wesley's face stared back at her in rough pencil strokes, captured from the haze of a dream she hadn't meant to remember. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the book. She should turn the page, focus on something else. But instead, She traced the lines of his jaw, the curve of his mouth, the way his eyes always seemed to hold something just out of reach. This was ridiculous. She snapped the book shut and pushed it to the edge of the table, grabbing a clean canvas instead. She needed to work. To focus. The gallery owner stopped by while she was cleaning brushes, eyeing her paintings with a critical expression. "Your work is good, Madeline. But I need something bigger. Something people can't walk past without stopping." She nodded, pretending she had an idea. By the time she got to the cafe, the place was already packed. The air smelled like espresso and fresh bread, the hum of conversation filling the space. She tied her apron and slid behind the counter, greeting regulars with the kind of easy smiles that came from routine. The shift passed in a blur of coffee orders, ringing phones, and the clatter of dishes. By noon, her feet ached, and her head was pounding from lack of sleep. She took a break in the back, sitting on an overturned milk crate, scrolling through emails on her phone. Bills, promotions, a reminder about Theo's school project. Normal things. Real things. But still, Wesley sat somewhere in the back of her mind, as if he were waiting. That night, after Theo had fallen asleep, she curled up on the couch with a glass of wine, flipping through a magazine. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually soothed her, but tonight it felt heavier. She pulled out her phone, hovering over a blank message screen. One text. It would be easy. But what would she even say? She tossed the phone onto the coffee table and rubbed her temples. This didn't matter. It couldn't. The next day, she ran into an old friend while picking up groceries. They stood in the cereal aisle, catching up in that polite, slightly distant way people do when they haven't seen each other in years. "So, seeing anyone?" her friend asked, eyebrows raised. Madeline laughed, shaking her head. "I barely have time to sleep, let alone date." Her friend smiled, launching into a story about her own relationship, but Madeline only half listened. The question clung to her. She wasn't seeing anyone, but she was dreaming about someone, night after night, a man she had never truly met but somehow knew. She pushed the thought away and grabbed a box of cereal. Later, while walking home, she caught herself scanning the crowd. Her stomach clenched. She was looking for him. She told herself it was nothing. Just habit. But it didn't feel like nothing. Wesley woke up to the sound of his alarm vibrating against the nightstand, the mechanical hum filling the quiet of his penthouse. He exhaled slowly, pressing his palm against his face before shutting it off. His body felt heavy, weighed down by something beyond exhaustion. His bed was perfectly made, the sheets still tucked in on one side, the pillows undisturbed except for the one beneath his head. Everything about the room was pristine, spacious, minimal, cold. But the dream still clung to him. Madeline had been there again. They had been sitting in a bookstore, surrounded by towering shelves and the scent of worn pages. She had been reading something, curled up in one of those old leather chairs that seemed to swallow her whole, and he had been watching her, amused, as she flipped a page and frowned. She had looked up, catching him staring, and smirked. "You have terrible taste in books, by the way." "Excuse me?" "You read the ones with too many words and not enough feeling." She had tossed persuasion at him, the same book he had handed her in another dream, as if their conversations existed on a loop, circling back in ways he was just starting to notice. Then he had woken up, alone in a bed too big for one person, in a city that never truly felt like his. A knock sounded at his door. "Sir, your father is waiting in the study," Marcus, his assistant, announced through the heavy wood. Wesley pushed himself upright and ran a hand through his hair. "I'll be down in 10. As expected, Richard Harrington was already dressed for the day in a suit so sharp it looked like it might cut through stone. He sat in his usual chair, sipping black coffee, flipping through reports like the fate of the company depended on every decimal point. "You're late," Richard said without looking up. It's 7 a.m., Wesley muttered, settling into the chair across from him. His father finally lifted his gaze, cool and calculating. And yet, somehow, still late. Wesley didn't bother responding. This was how their conversations went. He was supposed to be precise, focused, unwavering, never distracted, never uncertain. Richard closed the folder in his hands and leaned back. We need to discuss the engagement party. There it was. The thing he had been avoiding. Autumn's family has finalized the guest list. Your mother is working on the floral arrangements. We'll need you to approve the details by this afternoon. Wesley nodded stiffly, rolling his shoulders. Fine. His father studied him, then set his coffee down. Is there a problem? No. Good. Richard stood, already moving toward the door. I trust there won't be. Wesley waited until he was gone before exhaling, rubbing his temples. He had known this was coming. He had agreed to it, had let himself believe that marriage was about stability, about two people making a logical, mutually beneficial decision. Autumn Whitmore was poised, sophisticated, and completely unshaken by expectations. Their engagement had been arranged so smoothly it was as if neither of them had even needed to be present for it. It was everything his father wanted. Everything that made sense. And yet, every night, he dreamed of Madeline. At the office, he moved through his day the way he always did, meetings, negotiations, financial reports. Everything structured, precise, methodical. His father had trained him well. But in the quiet moments, when he wasn't speaking, when he wasn't making decisions worth millions, his mind wandered. Madeline would hate this place. He could already picture her unimpressed expression, the way she would cross her arms and raise an eyebrow at the pristine walls, the glass offices, the coldness of it all. Do you ever do anything that doesn't involve numbers and contracts? He could almost hear it. Almost. At lunch, he sat across from Autumn in a restaurant where the waitstaff knew their orders before they even spoke. She was perfect, as always, her blonde hair pulled back in a sleek bun, her diamond earrings catching the light, her movements as precise as the world they lived in. You've been distracted lately, she said, stirring her tea. He didn't immediately respond. Autumn never wasted words, never fished for meaningless small talk. If she was asking, it was because she had noticed. I've been busy, he finally said, reaching for his drink. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. Is that all it is? He hesitated, just for a second. Yes. Autumn held his gaze, then nodded, picking up her menu. Good. It was that simple. She accepted his answer, because in her world, feelings were secondary to actions. He had agreed to this engagement, this arrangement, and there was no reason for anything to change. That night, he sat in his penthouse with a drink in his hand, the city stretching out below him, glowing and endless. He should have felt like he was at the top of the world. Instead, he felt like he was watching it from behind glass. The whiskey burned his throat as he leaned back against the couch, tilting his head toward the ceiling. He had everything he was supposed to want. The wealth, the power, the carefully structured life. Madeline was struggling to pay rent. She was working double shifts at a cafe, painting in a studio she could barely afford, juggling bills and single motherhood without complaint. They had nothing in common. And yet, every time he closed his eyes, she was the only thing that felt real. He climbed into bed, willing himself to sleep without her invading his thoughts. But when he drifted off, Madeline was already waiting for him. Madeline was in the middle of a lunch rush, hands moving automatically as she balanced plates on one arm and wiped a coffee spill off the counter with the other. The cafe was loud, packed with regulars and tourists alike, the espresso machine hissing, silverware clinking against ceramic. She barely heard her name over the chaos until someone cleared their throat directly in front of her. She looked up, fully prepared to tell whoever it was that she was busy, only to freeze mid-motion. Wesley Harrington was standing on the other side of the counter, impossibly out of place in his tailored navy suit, looking as if he had absolutely no idea what he was doing here. Her stomach clenched. "What the hell are you doing?" He opened his mouth, hesitated, then glanced around, as if just realizing that this was the kind of place where people noticed things. A pair of college students at a nearby table were already whispering, probably trying to figure out why a man who looked like he belonged in a boardroom was standing in a tiny, family-run cafe that smelled like burnt toast. "Can we talk?" he asked, shifting his weight. Madeline narrowed her eyes. "You think this is a good time?" He didn't flinch. "It's important." She sighed, looking toward the back. "Rita, can you cover me for a few?" Her manager, an older woman with no patience for theatrics, waved her off without looking up from the cash register. "Take 10. Madeline yanked off her apron and gestured toward the door. "Fine." Outside. The sidewalk was just as crowded as inside, but at least it gave her a little breathing room. She crossed her arms and stared at Wesley, waiting for him to say something. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "This is going to sound ridiculous. That's usually how our conversations go." He huffed a small laugh but didn't look any less tortured. "I don't know how else to say it, so I'm just going to say it." She raised an eyebrow. "By all means." "I'm engaged." Madeline blinked, then let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Wesley frowned. "Why is that funny?" She shook her head, still laughing. Because you tracked me down in the middle of a workday to tell me that? Like it's some kind of plot twist?" His jaw tightened. "It's not just that I'm engaged." Madeline crossed her arms. "Oh, is there more?" "Yes." He met her gaze, something frustrated and desperate flickering there. "I can't get married while dreaming about you every single night." Her laughter died instantly. The sounds of the street rushed back in, car horns, snippets of conversations, the rhythmic tap of heels against the pavement. She stared at him, the words settling uneasily in her chest. "You, what?" "I dream about you," he said, quieter now. "Every night. I see you before I see her. I hear your voice before I hear hers. I wake up, and I have to remind myself that you aren't part of my life. That we don't." He stopped, exhaling sharply, like even saying it out loud exhausted him. "I don't know what to do with that." Madeline should have felt something, guilt, confusion, maybe even something stupidly sentimental, but all she felt was annoyed. She scoffed. "Well, that sounds like a personal problem." His shoulders tensed. "Madeline." "No," she cut him off, shaking her head. "I'm serious." "What do you want me to do about it? Do you want me to give you permission to say, 'Go ahead, Wesley, marry the woman your family picked out for you'?" She threw up her hands. "Because honestly, I do give you permission. Marry her. Have a perfect, polished, well-planned life." "What does that have to do with me?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I can't marry her while this is still happening. And again, not my problem." "Madeline." She groaned, turning away from him, ready to walk back inside. "I have actual issues to deal with. I have bills. I have a kid. I have 2 jobs. I do not have time for some wealthy, conflicted businessman who is suddenly having an identity crisis because his subconscious won't let him settle down with his beautiful, magazine cover fiancée." His voice was quiet but sharp. "You think this is about me having an identity crisis?" She turned back. "Yes. Yes, I do. You spent your whole life being told what to do, and now, for the first time," she pointed at him, cutting herself off with an annoyed growl. "Ugh, I just said I wasn't going to say that." He blinked. "Say what?" "Nothing." She took a breath, pressing her fingers to her temples. You don't know what this is, so you're making it my responsibility. But it's not. I don't have the luxury of standing around, trying to figure out what dreams mean. I have to pay rent, Wesley. Something in his expression shifted, the frustration ebbing into something else. I know that, he said after a moment. I know your life is different from mine. That's exactly why I need your help. Because I don't have anyone in my world who can even begin to understand what this is. Madeline closed her eyes for a beat, breathing through the wave of exhaustion crashing over her. She wanted to ignore all of this, pretend she hadn't seen him, pretend she didn't feel the same frustration gnawing at her. But the truth was, she did understand. She just didn't want to. She opened her eyes. And what exactly do you expect me to do? His mouth pressed into a line. I don't know yet. That's reassuring. He let out a short, humorless laugh. I'm asking you to help me figure this out. Because I can't figure it out on my own. And I need to figure it out. There was something about the way he said it, like this wasn't just some rich man existential crisis, like this was ruining him. For a second, she considered it. Then she shook her head. Wesley, no. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. Why not? Because I don't want to be responsible for solving your problem. Because I don't want to be part of your problem. She exhaled, stepping back toward the cafe door. Because I think you already know what you have to do, and you're looking for a way to avoid it. He flinched slightly, but didn't argue. She turned the handle, pausing just before stepping inside. Don't come here again. She didn't look back. Madeline was elbow-deep in dishwater when the bell over the cafe door chimed. She didn't need to look up. She already knew. Wesley Harrington was back. She squeezed her eyes shut for a brief moment, counted to 3, and turned around. He looked out of place, as usual. The kind of man who probably hadn't touched a sink full of dirty dishes in his life, standing in a cafe where the scent of burnt toast permanently clung to the air. His suit was slightly less formal today, though, no tie, the top button undone, sleeves rolled up like he was making an effort to look, what? Approachable? Normal? Madeline, he started. She held up a hand. No. His brow furrowed. You don't even know what I'm going to say. I don't have to, she said, drying her hands on a rag. You already dragged me outside yesterday for your dramatic monologue about how you can't possibly get married while dreaming about me, and I distinctly remember telling you not to come back. He shifted, looking nervous. That was new. She sighed. Out with it, Wesley. He exhaled. I have a proposal. Her stomach did something complicated and annoyed. Jesus. Are you proposing to me now? He blinked. What? No. That's not, he let out a frustrated breath. Look, I know you don't want to deal with this. But I need to fix it. And I need your help. She crossed her arms. Again. Not my problem. He hesitated for only a second before saying the words that changed everything. I'll pay all your expenses for a year if you help me figure this out. Madeline opened her mouth, then closed it. A full year. Rent. Bills. Theo's school fees. Gone. Covered. Her brain immediately tried to do the math, but she didn't even know how to begin calculating the weight that would lift off her shoulders. She pressed her fingers to her temple. You do realize how insane you sound, right? Yes, he said without hesitation. But my happiness depends on this. Please. Something about the way he said it made her pause. This wasn't just about some rich guy panicking over an engagement. He looked wrecked. Like this was actually ruining him. She rubbed a hand down her face, then looked up at him. Fine. But this is a business arrangement. No weird romantic fate nonsense. No dramatic speeches about feelings. Just a clear goal, and when we reach it, we walk away. He nodded. Agreed. She sighed. God, I cannot believe I'm doing this. And just like that, they had a deal. The problem? They had absolutely no idea what to do next. They sat in a cafe, not her cafe, because Wesley apparently had a rule against eating in places where the chairs wobbled, and stared at each other over untouched drinks. Where do we even start? Madeline asked, stirring her coffee. Wesley leaned back, arms crossed. We need an expert. Someone who deals with, I don't know, dreams. The subconscious. That kind of thing. She arched an eyebrow. Are you suggesting we Google, help, I am in love with a woman I only know from my dreams? He sighed. I'm open to ideas. She pinched the bridge of her nose. Fine. Let's be logical. Dreams are a subconscious thing. That means we start with a therapist. Dr. Alden Turner was one of those high-end therapists who usually dealt with CEOs having existential crises, so Wesley had no trouble getting an appointment within 24 hours. They sat across from him in an office filled with modern furniture and bookshelves arranged in an irritatingly symmetrical fashion. Dr. Turner listened with a neutral expression as they explained their situation, occasionally nodding and making small notes in his leather-bound notebook. When they finished, he leaned forward, folding his hands. Well, he said, smiling in the gentle, patronizing way therapists do when they're about to disappoint you. This sounds like a classic case of unresolved emotions manifesting in shared dream experiences. Wesley frowned. Unresolved emotions? Dr. Turner nodded. It's entirely possible that you're both drawn to something in each other that your waking minds haven't fully processed yet. The subconscious often finds ways to communicate things we repress. Madeline rubbed her temples. So, what? We're just supposed to have a deep conversation about our feelings, and the dreams will magically stop. Not necessarily, Dr. Turner said. But I would suggest individual sessions to explore what these dreams might symbolize in your personal lives. Wesley shot Madeline a look. Madeline shot him one right back. She turned back to Dr. Turner. Yeah, thanks. That was extremely unhelpful. Their next stop was a church. Neither of them had been particularly religious, but at this point, they were running out of logical options. Father Greg was kind, in the way older priests usually were, calm, patient, unbothered by their unusual predicament. He listened carefully, nodding every now and then, before finally sighing and leaning back in his chair. There are some things that are not meant to be understood, he said simply. Madeline crossed her arms. I feel like that's just a nice way of saying I don't know. Father Greg smiled, not denying it. Some things are mysteries for a reason. Maybe this is something you're not meant to solve. Maybe you're meant to simply experience it. Wesley looked exhausted. But what if I need to solve it? The priest studied him for a moment. Then I would ask why it's so important to you to end something that, by your own words, feels deeply significant. Wesley hesitated. Madeline gave him a pointed look. See? I told you this was a rich guy existential crisis. They left without any answers. Which is how they ended up sitting across from Madame Celeste, a self-proclaimed psychic who worked out of the back of a crystal shop and smelled vaguely like cinnamon and old books. Madeline had already decided this was a waste of time, but Wesley insisted they cover every possibility. Madame Celeste studied them carefully before flipping over a deck of tarot cards. She hummed thoughtfully, tapping one with a long, jeweled nail. You are fated, she said, her voice thick with certainty. Madeline groaned. Oh my God. Wesley cleared his throat. Fated, how? Madame Celeste's eyes gleamed. Your souls are intertwined. You have met before, in other lives. And you will meet again, in the ones yet to come. Madeline rubbed her temples. I knew this was a mistake. The psychic ignored her, turning her attention to Wesley. You are fighting what has already been written. That is why the dreams won't stop. Madeline stood. Okay. We're done here. Wesley followed, looking just as frustrated as she felt. As they walked out onto the street, Madeline let out a long breath. Well. That was useless. Wesley pinched the bridge of his nose. This was supposed to help. She patted his arm. Yeah, well. Welcome to my life, rich boy. They had no answers. No solutions. And worst of all, the dreams weren't going anywhere. Madeline sat across from Wesley in his car, her legs tucked up on the seat, arms wrapped around her knees. Rain splattered against the windshield, blurring the city lights outside. The car was warm, the heater humming softly, but she still felt cold. Not from the weather. From exhaustion. From frustration. From spending days chasing answers that didn't exist. They had tried everything: science, faith, intuition, logic, and yet, every night, the dreams continued. Nothing made them stop. Nothing made them make sense. Madeline sighed and tilted her head toward him. We have no leads. No answers. We don't even have a good theory. Wesley tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. I know. The rain drummed louder, filling the silence between them. She exhaled, rubbing her temples. Okay. Let's try something different. His eyes flicked to her, wary. Like what? Let's tell each other everything. He frowned. We've already. No, she shook her head. Not just surface-level things. We go deeper. Childhood. Family. Friends. Every dumb detail. Everything. Wesley hesitated, then nodded. Fine. She sat up straighter. Okay. You go first. He gave her a look. You're the one who suggested this. Exactly, she said. That means you start. He sighed and leaned back against the seat, staring out the windshield as he spoke. I was born in New York. My parents weren't really parents, more like business partners who happened to share a last name. They had expectations. Structure. Rules. I learned how to hold a proper conversation with investors before I learned how to ride a bike. He let out a humorless laugh. Not that I ever actually did learn how to ride a bike. That wasn't considered a necessary skill. Madeline snorted. Tragic. He smirked. I had a tutor instead of school. Summers were spent at a house in the Hamptons, not that it mattered because my schedule didn't change. I had no cousins, no siblings. My parents liked things clean. Controlled. Predictable. Madeline studied him. Did you ever want something different? He was quiet for a second. I didn't know anything different existed. She chewed on her lip. Okay. What about friends? He hesitated. Mostly other kids whose parents ran in the same circles. No one I was really close to. I wasn't allowed to be. My father thought friendships were a distraction. She stared at him. Jesus. This is depressing. He huffed a laugh. I survived. She shook her head, thinking for a second. All right. Let's get more specific. Have you ever, and I mean ever, lived anywhere else? Gone anywhere weird? Been to a small town you don't remember? Wesley's brows pulled together. No. My entire life was planned down to the minute. No detours. No surprises. She groaned. That makes no sense. If we were meant to know each other, there has to be something connecting us. He turned his head toward her. Your turn. Madeline sighed, shifting against the seat. All right. I grew up in a small town outside Chicago. Nothing fancy, nothing exciting. Just normal. My parents were fine, I guess. My mom worked as a teacher. My dad ran a little hardware store. I have an older sister, but we don't talk much. Wesley studied her. Why not? She hesitated. She didn't approve of my choices. What choices? Having a kid before I had a career. Not settling down with someone stable. Trying to make something of myself with art instead of getting a real job. She let out a breath. She's a lawyer. You can imagine the lectures. His expression softened slightly. And your parents? Madeline shrugged. They weren't thrilled about the whole single mother thing, but they love Theo. That's what matters. Wesley was quiet for a moment. She exhaled. I went to public school. Worked at a diner in high school. Got a partial scholarship for an art program but dropped out after 2 years because Theo happened. She glanced at him. Nothing in that story screams soul connection to a billionaire, does it? He didn't answer. They sat in silence, both of them turning it over in their minds. Nothing. They had nothing. Madeline groaned and slumped against the seat. I give up. We're not connected. We've never been connected. Maybe this is just a weird glitch in the universe. Maybe we were supposed to almost meet, but we didn't, and now some cosmic force is trying to fix it. Wesley tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, staring out into the rain. Then, slowly, he said, or we did meet. And we just don't remember. She frowned. We've been over this. We haven't met. Not consciously, he said. But what if we were in the same place? At the same time? Just, not aware of each other? Madeline hesitated. That's a reach. He turned toward her. It makes more sense than soulmates or fate or whatever the hell that psychic was talking about. She bit her lip, considering. So what, you're suggesting we do what? Go through every moment of our lives and compare notes? He met her gaze. No. But we can go to where it all started. Madeline frowned. Where what started? The dreams, he said simply. When did they start for you? She hesitated. A little over 6 months ago. His jaw tensed. Mine started a little over a year ago. She shook her head. That doesn't help. We already knew the timing was weird. But what if the dreams didn't just happen, he asked. What if something triggered them? Madeline stilled. For weeks, they had been trying to figure out what the dreams meant. But they had never stopped to ask why they had started in the first place. She swallowed. You think there was a moment? A specific event? He nodded. Something in her chest tightened. Okay. Let's say you're right. How do we find it? Wesley's voice was calm. We go back. She frowned. Back where? He exhaled. Our hometowns. She stared at him. You want to take a field trip? I want to go to every important place from our childhoods, he said. Family homes. Schools. Old haunts. If something triggered this, maybe going back will shake something loose. Madeline hesitated, tapping her fingers against her thigh. That's insane. He smirked. More insane than hiring a psychic? She groaned. Touché. The rain softened outside. She let out a slow breath. Okay, fine. We'll try it. Wesley gave a small nod, turning the key in the ignition. Madeline crossed her arms. But I swear, if this ends up being a total waste of time, you owe me a year's worth of coffee. He chuckled. Deal. The car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the city, carrying them toward answers they weren't sure they wanted. Wesley had expected something dramatic. A rush of recognition. A sudden, cinematic moment where everything snapped into focus. Instead, standing in front of his childhood home, he felt nothing. The estate was just as he remembered, sprawling, pristine, suffocating. The hedges were perfectly trimmed, the stone facade untouched by time. It was the kind of place designed to be admired, not lived in. Madeline stood beside him, hands stuffed in the pockets of her jacket, unimpressed. It looks like one of those houses they use in movies to show that a character has daddy issues. He huffed a small laugh. Accurate. A housekeeper let them in, eyeing Madeline curiously but saying nothing. Wesley led her through the grand hall, past the sitting room where his mother used to host charity meetings, past his father's study, where he had been lectured more times than he could count. Anything? She asked. He shook his head. No. They went through family photo albums, flipping through glossy pages of holidays, business parties disguised as gatherings, pictures of him in tailored suits standing beside people he barely remembered. Madeline tapped one of the photos. You were a cute kid, though. Look at this little face. Who knew he'd grow up to have a dream-related nervous breakdown? Wesley ignored that. They checked every place that had mattered, his childhood bedroom, the private school he had attended, the Hamptons house where his family spent summers. Every memory was sharp, every moment accounted for. But none of them had anything to do with Madeline. They left the next morning, the long drive to her hometown stretching before them. Her childhood was the opposite of his. Where his had been structured, polished, and designed for status, hers had been filled with warmth, clutter, and real life. They walked through the town where she had grown up, a place where people still knew each other by name, where coffee shops had hand-painted signs, where memories were wrapped in the everyday. This is where I had my first job, she said, pointing to a diner. I was a terrible waitress. He smirked. I find that hard to believe. Oh, you'd believe it if you saw how many milkshakes I dropped. They visited her old house, her high school, the park where she had spent afternoons sketching. Still, nothing. No missing puzzle piece. No lightning bolt of recognition. By the time they arrived at the local community college, Madeline was visibly losing patience. Okay, if this doesn't work, I swear to God, I am officially calling it. Wesley stopped. His breath caught in his throat as he looked around. The steps leading up to the main building. The banners swaying in the wind. The courtyard filled with students walking across the campus. He had been here before. His fingers curled slightly. Wesley? His voice was quieter than he meant it to be. I've been here. Madeline frowned. What? He turned in a slow circle, the details clicking into place. There was a graduation. 2 years ago. My father had some distant family friend, someone he had invested in, whose son was graduating. I had to come. Her expression changed. She looked toward the steps. I was here. The words settled between them. Wesley turned to her, pulse climbing. You were? Madeline's lips parted slightly. A friend of mine, her younger brother was graduating. I came to support her. He let out a sharp breath. They had been in the same place, at the same time. And that was when the dreams had started. Madeline pressed her fingers to her temple. So we did meet. Not exactly, Wesley said, heart pounding. But we were here. Her head tilted, her eyes flickering with something close to disbelief. You think this is what triggered it? He exhaled, looking around again. I don't know what else it could be. For the first time, they had an answer. Not a why. Not a how. But a when. Relief flooded his chest. He met Madeline's gaze, and for the first time in weeks, they smiled. They had found it. They finally knew when it all began. Madeline unlocked her apartment door, stepping inside and dropping her bag onto the couch. Wesley followed, lingering near the doorway, hands in his pockets. Neither of them spoke, the weight of their discovery settling in. They had found the missing piece, the graduation, the moment their paths had crossed, the place where it had all started. And yet, Madeline rubbed her temples. So that was it. Wesley sighed, stepping further into the room. That was it. They stood there for a moment, waiting for something: relief, understanding, clarity. Nothing came. Madeline groaned. Why doesn't this feel like an answer? Wesley dropped onto the couch, rubbing his jaw. Because it's not. They knew when the dreams had started. They even knew where they had been when it happened. But they still had no clue why or, more importantly, how to stop them. She sank onto the armrest. We should feel better, right? Wesley gave a humorless laugh. Should. Silence. Madeline leaned her head back, staring at the ceiling. God, I really thought this was going to be it. That we'd go home and just stop dreaming about each other. Wesley exhaled. Yeah. Me too. Madeline let her thoughts spin for a second, then sat up, eyes narrowing. Okay. What if this was the answer? He turned his head toward her, skeptical. You just said it wasn't. No, listen. She sat up straighter, something sparking in her chest. What if we were supposed to meet that day? What if the dreams are fate's way of telling us that something got left unfinished? Wesley scoffed. Fate? Madeline ignored him. What if the reason the dreams won't stop is because something should have happened that day, but didn't? What if the universe is trying to fix it? He leaned back against the couch, shaking his head. So what? You think we just go on a date and that magically fixes this? She shrugged. What do we have to lose? Wesley blinked. You're serious. I am serious. She leaned forward. We've tried science, religion, psychology, a psychic. None of it worked. We don't know anything except that we should have met that day, but we didn't. So let's see what happens if we just catch up. Wesley stared at her, searching her face. You think the universe wants us to go on a date? Madeline threw up her hands. I don't know. But we've tried everything else. And I swear, if I have to have one more dream where you ask me what my favorite book is, I'm going to throw myself into oncoming traffic. His mouth twitched. Persuasion. She groaned. Exactly. You already know my favorite book. That's how long we've been having these stupid dreams. Just one date. One. If nothing happens, we go back to ignoring each other and pretend this never happened. Wesley hesitated. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. Fine. Madeline blinked. Fine. Fine, he repeated, standing up. Let's do it. The date was set for the next evening. Madeline tried to keep her expectations low. She tried not to think about how weird it was to go on a date with someone she had technically known for months but had never actually been with in real life. She tried not to overthink what she was going to wear, but still changed her outfit 3 times before settling on a simple black dress and a leather jacket. She told herself it wasn't a real date. She ignored how much it felt like one. Wesley picked her up outside her apartment, his usual suit swapped for something slightly more relaxed, still expensive, still tailored, but softer. They started with dinner at a quiet restaurant, the kind with candlelit tables and old jazz playing in the background. At first, it was stiff. Forced. They had been so used to dreaming their conversations that they almost didn't know how to have them in real life. But as the night went on, the tension faded. Wesley told her about the first time he had snuck out of his house as a teenager, driving into the city alone just to see what life looked like without security teams and schedules. Madeline told him about the time she had taken Theo to an art museum, only for him to loudly declare that one of the sculptures looked like a giant butt. They talked. They laughed. They felt. The moment shifted somewhere between the second glass of wine and dessert. Madeline reached for something on the table at the same time Wesley did, and their fingers brushed. The air crackled. Her breath hitched. Wesley froze, eyes locked on hers, something unreadable flashing across his face. And then, just like that, they weren't thinking anymore. He leaned in. She met him halfway. The kiss was slow at first. Tentative. Then, all at once, it wasn't. Electricity. Heat. A rush of something so familiar that it almost knocked her off balance. And then. Thunder crashed outside. The lights flickered. Madeline pulled back, breathless, staring at him. "Did you?" Wesley exhaled, looking just as stunned. "Yeah." She pressed her fingers to her lips, pulse racing. That felt like everything fell into place. Silence stretched between them, thick with something neither of them could explain. Then, slowly, Wesley smiled. Madeline let out a breath, laughing lightly. "Okay. So maybe I was right." He chuckled. "You hate saying that, don't you?" She smirked. "You have no idea." They walked home together, something light, right, settling between them. Madeline climbed into bed that night, heart still thrumming, wondering if the dreams would come. But they didn't. She woke up to sunlight. To quiet. To the first full night of dreamless sleep since that graduation 2 years ago.